A new FIFA report found out 1 out of 5 players received abusive online comments. So let's talk about it. A new and recent FIFA and FIFAPRO report highlights how terrible online abuse was at the 2023 FIFA Women's World Cup earlier this summer. It highlighted what kind of abuse was targeted, on which platforms, and directly which team was affected the most. So today I'll be discussing some of these findings and the key statistics that this report highlights. Now, my instant reaction going through this report was obviously upset, but at the same time not surprised or shocked. I think there's a few stats that will stand out, and I think as we go through it today, we'll get to those stats. But this unfortunately was not shocking, and I actually wonder if this was ran during the 2019 World Cup or even last year at the 2022 Euros. Obviously, UEFA and FIFA are different organizations, so each would have their own report and analysis. But if we have these kind of reports come out after every single major competition, I feel like we'd see a pretty steady trend of the stats that we just saw from this World Cup. So last year, right before the men's Qatar World Cup, FIFA actually launched a social media protection services that kind of moderates and somewhat acts as a protection service over the accounts of the coaches, the athletes, and some of the staff that are involved in FIFA events. So that was launched last year before the men's World Cup and obviously was used for the women's World Cup this year. Over 2,000 active accounts were overseen by this protection service, as well as those were the accounts used for this report. Like I mentioned, this includes players, coaches, officials, team accounts, ex-players, media accounts, even active tournament accounts. So that is probably going to be your FIFA accounts in different languages. The breakdown of these accounts, the major portion of them, 37% being Instagram, then that is followed by Facebook and then Twitter. Now, this is very, very interesting to highlight because we will get to see the number of which platform actually produced the most amount of hatred comments or abusive comments or whatever comments you want to label them as. So keep in mind the ranking of Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter kind of is the major chunk of what was highlighted. Out of those accounts, 5.1 million posts / comments were analyzed. Over 103,000 were flagged to be analyzed and reviewed by humans. And then out of that, 7,085 were abusive comments and reported to that platform that they originated from. During this analysis, just under 6,000 accounts were detected to be spewing out this abusive bunch of comments, and then 628 verified identities were responsible for those comments. Now, it's important to note that how something is being categorized as abusive or sexual or homophobic or X, Y, and Z is depending on the policy of that platform. So depending on the policy of rules that Instagram and Twitter and Facebook have, that's kind of the criteria that this analysis was following. Now, the key finding was that 1 in 5 players were targeted. This means more than 150 out of the almost 700 players that were monitored were targeted with some form of discriminatory, abusive, or threatening content. Out of that content, homophobia was flagged to be prolific, with almost twice the percentage compared to the FIFA 2022 in Qatar. In fact, almost 50% of all detected abuse across the tournament was sexist, sexual, and homophobic in nature. That is something to reckon with. Out of the national teams, it was highlighted that the US women's national team were the most targeted of the tournament. 2 players were targeted above all, one from the USA. Reports kind of suggest that is Rapinoe, and if you were on social media during the World Cup, you would probably think so too. And another player from Argentina, she could be that Argentinian player with a Cristiano Ronaldo tattoo on her leg, I believe, which again, if you were watching any Argentina game and scrolling through Twitter, you saw some pretty nasty comments. But it wasn't just the players, it was match officials that were also targeted directly. And a very important stat highlighted here is that politicians' posts / comments triggered large sections of abuse. That's going to be a very important part of the conversation as we move forward. Looking at this diagram, you can clearly tell that the general abuse is slightly higher than homophobia, and that is then followed by sexual comments and then sexist comments, and then that is not very far off racism either. If we take a closer look at the breakdown of nationality and abuse, American players topped the charts. It's also highlighted that predominantly politically motivated abuse was targeted to 2 to 3 key players from the US squad. Wouldn't take a rocket scientist to figure out it's Rapinoe, probably one of the other veterans, and a person of color from that squad. English and Spanish players also make it in the top 5, probably because of the volume, the sheer amount of comments that came out following the events of the final. Probably not actually during the final, but following the final. One of a very interesting stat here is you can tell that the biggest chunk of the comments directed to those Spanish players were sexual in nature. Going down a little bit, you would see Nigeria, where racism or racist comments are pretty prevalent within that squad as well. This report also neatly highlights the times that the spikes were happening, and the biggest spike out of all these abusive comments happened when the US took exit to the World Cup. Again, I think when we discuss this a little bit further, there's probably a few reasons as to why that happened. And then following that spike was the World Cup final. Again, unfortunately, probably not for the events of the 90-minute game, but likely what followed after the final whistle. Shockingly, but also not shockingly, 67% of that hate came out of North and Central America. To me, that is so troubling. You can probably expect this to be US on US hate, considering Canada didn't make it in the top 10 and Mexico wasn't even at the World Cup. US topped the charts. It's not really hard to make that connection that it was predominantly US to US abuse, which is very, very troubling. This is the final large big stab before we jump into discussion, but players at the FIFA Women's World Cup were 29% more likely to be targeted with online abuse than the FIFA World Cup Qatar 2022. So to put that into comparative numbers, 7,000 out of the 5.1 million highlighted from the Women's World Cup were abusive. That ranges to about 0.14% compared to the 19,000 out of 20 million, which ranges about 0.10% to the Men's World Cup. So a pretty significant increase, again, 29%. And if you take the sheer difference of viewership and the number of comments analyzed, that's pretty troubling again to think about. So let's discuss this a little bit further. Obviously, we need to talk a little bit about the U.S. Women's National Team. And there's a very interesting report that came out of a university here in Canada that highlighted how important broadcasting companies and the way they present and cover the sport is actually influential to the audience and the viewership themselves. And it's also highlighted in this FIFA report is that obviously with these broadcasters hitting new highs, new peaks, new averages, I mean, like they broke their own records during the World Cup, they reach new audience. So that new audience, however they consume that sport, then whenever they're engaging with it online, they're spewing out their ideas and their opinions very similarly to how it was consumed. I mean, that's basic psychology. So if we turn a little bit to the fact that the U.S. Men's National Team received the most amount of hate comments, 2 or 3 players specifically got politically motivated comments. 67% of those hate comments were out of Central North America. You can think about the fact that it was Fox Sports who carried this event. Who did Fox Sports have? Lalas and Carly Lloyd. And I think most of us are aware of her comments during the World Cup. Whenever I voiced any criticism of Carly Lloyd, she wasn't too impressed with me. She's actually blocked me on Twitter. So I've made it into that very sacred place. Not so sacred, actually. I feel like it's a pretty popular place. But the way that she spoke about her teammates, and I really wouldn't even call it criticism, and I'd love to think if you think it's criticism, but how Carly Lloyd spoke and talked about the U.S. Women's National Team getting knocked out and the performances following the Portugal draw, that was not criticism. That was downright bashing, and that was just absolutely humiliating some of her former teammates and supposedly the nation that she captained. This is a player who has been on the U.S. Men's National Team. She's been through the fights. She's been through, the locker room conversations where they needed to come out and have a big performance. Probably didn't have a big performance. She's also a player who missed a penalty in the 2011 World Cup final. So all these comments that came about Rapinoe and the players, wanting to just have fun, they didn't want to perform, was just so confusing to actually digest because she's a player who has been in that environment before. And again, like I mentioned, she's missed a penalty at a World Cup final, and it's fine. I mean, that's football. You make some of them, you don't. But the way she came out and spoke about Rapinoe and missing that penalty and just being unprepared was totally uncalled for. When a player of her status and her reach makes those comments, it unequivocally sends a message to the audience that they too can make those comments and get away with it. They too are actually entitled to make those sexist comments. They too are also entitled to have and send out those hatred comments on social media. She gives them that pass. She gives them that green light of, you know what, this is your opinion, you're absolutely entitled to it. Which, yes, everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but not everything should be sent on social media, tagged with the player, and absolutely blasted everywhere. That is extremely troubling. Is Fox News going to look at this report and actually take an accountability? No. Carly Lloyd has actually taken on Twitter and said, well, when you actually perform bad, this is the kind of response that you receive. Which is so mind-boggling, because she is saying it's okay to receive this kind of abuse. It's okay to come out as the team with the most amount of abusive comments received, because this is what you deserve for your performance. I mean, can you imagine what kind of person you have to be to say that this is okay, this is allowed, we should normalize this, because this is what happens when you have a bad performance. It is shambolic. This has nothing to do with my opinion of what I think the US national team players send a message when they kneel down for the anthem. This is literally got nothing to do with any political opinion. But to normalize abusive and homophobic comments because of a missed penalty or a game that didn't go to plan is just so poor. And again, it comes from a former player, which just makes it 10 times worse. Twitter is where a lot of those abusive comments came out of. And Twitter, I think, is, for X, whatever you want to call it, has been such a weird place with the new takeover and stuff. But Twitter is where a lot of the reports come out. Twitter is a lot of where breaking news come out. Twitter is where a lot of trends, a lot of clips of goals or clips of the national anthem come out. It's almost like it allows for a shit show to happen, in other words. And I would think and actually really hope that a lot of the people making those comments and having those homophobic, sexist, abusive comments probably are not consumers of the sport. It's probably those who have enjoyed the rhetoric of hating on women's sports, and those who have seen a former footballer like Carly Lloyd say the comments and be like, well, if she's saying it, why can't we? Everybody remembers the Trump era and the U.S. men's national team and how they didn't go to the White House, and how a lot of Trump supporters, one would say, kind of rallied up against the U.S. men's national team. You are probably going to see that crowd, the ones voice their opinions. I hope it is a reminder for those who do consume the sport to bear in mind that these are humans. They're professional athletes, they're celebrities, they're, faces of the sport, all of this, absolutely. But it's just football at the end of the day. Like, these are humans that are out doing their job. Football is their job. Absolutely. With that status comes criticism and comes, unpleasant comments. But nothing should be at this rate. Nothing should be allowed to continue at this rate. So even us, as we consume the sport, need to be quite wary that at the end of the day, they're just humans. They could be your next street neighbor. No, this is not to say we can't have good criticism. I think this could be a biased one, but looking at TSN, for example, who carried the Women's World Cup here in Canada. Canada, by every standard and every measure, failed and crashed and had a disaster. The analysts, the journalists, the reporters covering from TSN did a brilliant job by being critical about the Canadian women's national team, but they're not slamming them. They're not out here absolutely bashing their players. In fact, I'll take a look at one of the former players, Amy Walsh. She's an Olympian. She played for the Canadian women's national team a while back. She played with Sinclair. She's pretty close with a lot of the players. She did the entirety of the World Cup with TSN, but looking at those Canada games that she had covered, she had constructive criticism. She was talking about what she believes Beth Priestman should and shouldn't do and what the players need to tweak, need to change. It's okay to criticize your national team. It's okay for former players to come out and be like, you know what, I've been in that locker room before and I know exactly how it feels to be trailing behind at halftime. That's okay. And nobody's taking that away from anybody. But there's a reason you could say that TSN was the carrier. They had the folks that they had. And thankfully, we didn't see Canadian players top these charts. Like I mentioned, it's a very important study that I highlighted that broadcasters have a very, very huge influence on the audience. FIFA report highlights it. When these audiences are peaking and you're reaching new groups and communities, you want to make sure that that first initial contact or how they're consuming that doesn't send them right away on Twitter to spew very nasty stuff. So that is a shameless shout out to Amy Walsh and TSN. But Canada could be an example for that. They didn't set a lot of examples at the World Cup, but this is an example that they could have set, and they did set. FIFA highlights that their service and kind of protection of players is going to get tighter and tighter as the tournaments go on, and obviously all they can do is report accounts and report posts, but at the end of the day, those reports go to that platform. So if it's not going against or beyond guidelines, then that comment can stay, or those policy rules can be like, well, that's free speech, you got to keep it up there. So FIFA can only do so much, and their services can only report and block and, have as much of an effect on these accounts and comments. But it does also call for the likes of Twitter, the likes of Instagram and Facebook to get tighter measures on what can be allowed to be commented and whatnot. There's no reason we should be going out saying discriminatory, sexually abusive, racist, gross comments. Gross comments are for lame people, and people who watch women's sports are not lame. So all of us here are probably not very lame. But it's an interesting report. Again, like I mentioned, it'd be really interesting to see how this would have fared with like the 2019 World Cup, last year's Euros, given how massive it was. Again, that being more of a European basis, you wouldn't have the US. How skewed would that be? Very interesting, and I'm sure as the game grows and organizers like FIFA and UEFA continue to also invest in their protection services, undoubtedly we'll be getting measures like this very, very frequently, and hopefully it's only better from now, because I don't think it can get worse than this. Now, I'd love to know your opinions on this report, any stat that shocked you, anything that you probably expected. Would love to hear your ideas on these key stats and insights. And yes, despite contrary beliefs that I may have abandoned this channel, I was actually a little bit busy and preoccupied with final exams at university. Now that is out of the way, I'm completely here watching women's sports and talking about it. So yes, plenty more content coming out. Exams out of the way. Expect a lot of fun videos, a lot of good content, good discussions, plenty of very, very knowledgeable folks to join me for good conversations. So if you're not subscribed, hit that subscribe button already. As always, to stay updated and to continue enjoying the beautiful game, make sure you subscribe to me here on YouTube and follow me on Twitter. And I will see you later.